So I'm happy because of three things. One is I'm not a member of either party, the goals movement or the evaluation movement. Frankly, I don't give a damn. I'm not an academic, and having to listen to some of this makes me proud that I chose to leave academia early on. But I am encouraged by the fact that all of you are sitting here and the fact that these kinds of debates go on. By way of introduction, my name is Stewart Paperin. I'm Executive Vice President of the Open Society, which is fundamentally not a development agency. It's fundamentally a human rights organization. And I'm president of Soros Economic Development Fund, which fundamentally is kind of a confusing hybrid. We are a not-for-profit that makes for-profit investments, but for developmental purposes. So we kind of tinker at the edges of development. We do what y'all, and to some degree, Bill, were talking about, which is entrepreneurship, which is we tinker. We find things that work, we find things that don't work. We fuss with them a little bit. We deal with people who are passionate about making money. The people with whom we invest in Ghana, such as, and I want to correct one point that you all made, we are not donors to Isoko. We are investors in Isoko. And every morning that the head of Isoko wakes up, he damn well better figure he needs to earn a profit to pay us back. Now, the fact that he does very good work and that he's developed a terrific developmental tool is very important, but he needs to earn a profit, and those are the kinds of people we invest in. The other reason I'm happy is that I run a $280 million development fund that's looking for ideas and is looking for the kinds of ideas that grow up here, that grow up in the Center for Global Development, that grow up at the Poverty Lab. And I've got money to spend, so I want to hear from all of you who have fundable development ideas. However, they need to be a business. They need to be capable of making a profit, because we're not a donor and we're not in the grant business on the SEDF side. We are on the Open Society side, and that is what we did with Millennium Villages, which I'll return to in a moment. We look at the landscape of developing countries, whether it be, and we're active in India, we're active in Africa, we're active in Haiti and other places. We are principally focused on post-conflict areas. It is what I describe as working at the lunatic edge of emerging markets. I mean, no rational investor would invest in the places that we do when we do. And a part of our role is to prove to them that you can. So we are very, very big believers in long-term demonstration effect without randomized controlled samples. We generally focus on three areas. We build financial services funds because we believe developing countries need to be able to mobilize capital. They need to be able to allow poor people to save money. They need to be able to allow businesses to borrow. They need to allow, for example, ideas such as weather insurance, which is being promoted by Isoko and is also being promoted by a group called Leapfrog, which is a micro-insurance fund that we were anchor investors in. We invest in agriculture, and because we believe it's one of the great developers of jobs and one of the great developers in a place like Africa of cash-based economies. Now, that doesn't say there aren't other things that people can do, and it doesn't say that perhaps making people productive in agriculture will prevent them from being more productive in IT or in logistics or in running a retail shop, but it gives you a choice. And we invest in logistics systems because the great missing plank of Africa is it has no logistics. I mean, it's incredible. There is no regional or Pan-African freight airline. There is no regional or Pan-African trucking company. There's been no consolidation, for example, in the trucking sector, which has happened in every other part of the world as economies emerge. And Why is that important? Because people need to be able to get goods to markets and need to be able to connect urban centers and rural centers, urban centers and urban centers, and that entire infrastructure is missing. We also fuss around, OSI fusses around the development world. We do periodically provide assistance to governments. You know, we've been instrumental. We've been close to the presidents of Sierra Leone and Liberia and Guinea, and we have helped them with macro advisory, underwriting the costs of macro advisory work, or underwriting the costs of bringing back diaspora people. One of the great tragedies, for example, in Liberia was a substantial portion of its educated class left during the wars. And the question is, how do you get somebody to give up earning $50,000 or $100,000 in the United States to come back and earn $2,000 or $5,000 in Liberia? So we've played around with that. There aren't any great solutions, but you know, hopefully we've made some contribution. So we're not development people. I've got no particular expertise in evaluation, and I have clearly told Bill, although I think there are interesting points that Michael raises and Bernadette raised in her articles, and I have heard, and I am fortunate to be close friends with Jeff Sachs and his team, and close friends with Paul Collier and his team, and hopefully will become close friends with Bill Easterly. I'm agnostic. I don't really care. I'm a really simple guy. Show me something that works and I'll put money behind it. So why did we invest in Millennium Villages? We put in close to $80 million. And how do we intend to share our experiences, and how does Millennium Villages intend to share theirs? And I want to make 2 or 3 very simple points that may sound like I'm engaging in debate, and I'm glad Bill did such a good job in hiding his predilection to assess Millennium Villages. It was really masterful. But firstly, I certainly am never going to defend public relations materials put out by Jeff Sachs. And I agree with you fully. I think Jeff always overclaims. I mean, he's a showman. He's a marketeer to some degree. He's also a serious scholar. But don't confuse scholarly work with marketing information. I trust most of you don't. I trust most of you don't run out and buy the medicine that's advertised on television every 25 minutes because there's an ad saying your elbows will be better or you'll be less depressed. You're more critical about that. Secondly, I do know that Millennium Villages has in the hopper a peer-reviewed article that is going to be published later this year. I think it is unfortunate that it hasn't been published to date, but you know, it is what it is. So why did we invest in Millennium Villages? This was a commitment made by my boss, by George Soros. I've worked for George for 16 years. I've worked directly for him. I've seen him at close sight. And something that's interesting, it was a classic decision that's very, very much in line with other decisions he's made. He bet on a person, and he bet on a program that we looked at that looked like it was feasible, didn't look like it was perfect. Nobody serious believed internally that it was going to cure poverty in 5 years. And we don't look at it as a short-term program. We very much look at this as a long-term program. And in fact, I think it was advertised as a 10-year program. And it has now completed its first 5 years of full operation. Although I guess if you count back to the early days of the Ethiopian village, it was probably 8 years. We made the investment for a simple reason. We thought there was substantial upside, and there was virtually no downside. The downside is, if it doesn't do what it's promised, it improves the lives of 500,000 people. Well, that's not phenomenal, but it's also not nothing. 500,000 people's lives was worth considering, and we did think there was substantial upside. We had internally, and we lodged 2 very serious criticisms, one of which was corrected, the other of which is now being corrected. One was it had systematically excluded local decision-making, local feedback, and particularly interaction with local and regional and state political people, which an awful lot of it depended upon, because an awful lot of the improvement in the village was an improvement in infrastructure, allowing services in and out of the village. And we thought they didn't get it, and what we did was to ask our African foundations, and we have foundations, 4 major foundations in Africa, to sit on an advisory board and work with Millennium Villages, and they did. The other criticism that we had, and it was particularly my criticism, and I am on the board of Millennium Promise, which is the parent organization, and I've raised this time and time and time again, is that unless you connect these villages and this agriculture with higher value, functioning commercial operations, and you turn these into businesses, as soon as the program is over, it will disappear. You must generate income to pay for inputs. You can't rely forever on aid. And they have been slow on the uptake, but they have now moved on the uptake, and we're working on this, and it's damn hard to do. It's extremely hard to do, to find ideas that work, and then trying to move an African farmer, particularly if it means his diversifying solely out of a cash crop, out of a food crop into a combination of food and cash crops, is not a trivial thing to be undertaken. You're putting somebody's life potentially at risk. And we didn't want to do that, and we don't want to do that. So those were issues that we had. The program was not perfect, but again, one of the points I would make, and I was really glad that I came this morning to listen to this, is one of the things that strikes me is that there's a fundamental difference between scholarly work in academia and fundamental development. And the point is a point that Bill made very clearly. He's been working on an article for 8 years. I think that's terrific. That's wonderful scholarly work. But it's not implementable and practical. It doesn't change anything except perhaps his ultimate pay. And he's now so highly paid, another article won't do anything. So the point I'm making is what I do, and to some degree what Michael does, is to work at the coalface where you really have to find implementable ideas. And what I find fascinating about development, and I hope all of you begin to, as you work through your careers, particularly the students, will find fascinating, is finding things that you can actually implement in a relative period of time and make a difference. Because I think scholarly work is terrific, and in my next life I may well be a scholar. But in this one, I really care about getting things done. Thank you. You know, there have undoubtedly been improvements in the villages. Food yields have increased, participation in school feeding programs have increased, health has increased. Now, whether there's causality or not is a perfectly good question that I don't know the answer to. You know, whether it's caused it or whether a rising tide floats all boats is an interesting question, and one ultimately that's useful to know the answer to. But as a practitioner and as a funder, I'm much more concerned with how do I keep this going? How do I make sure this rising tide continues to rise in these villages, and then that opportunities occur for these villages? You know, obviously causality cannot be dismissed, and I would argue that I think studying this stuff and controlled experimentation where it can be done is absolutely worthwhile. But one balances things, and one of the things one balances is cost, and the other is time to market. As anybody who has ever worked in product development or in a startup knows, time to market is critical. You can have the best idea in the world, and if you miss the market, you are just dead. And having been an investor in a company that was ready to go public 3 days after one of the major crashes in the market, and we missed the market forevermore. I know that all too well. As importantly, there is large-scale take-up. The government of Nigeria has made a significant decision to use their money, their public funds, to scale Millennium Village in their way, not with all the administrative baggage, not with all of the overhead, to 20% of the rural population. Now, how that goes is an interesting question. What they do will be worth looking at. Having people work in that scale up and trying to do measurement would be a very, very important thing, which is part of the reason that part of our grant to Millennium Villages is for evaluation. I mean, I think part of the grant, about $750,000, is specifically to do evaluation, and we demand evaluation at the end of this, but we demand it when you've got enough data to usefully paint the picture. But let me be clear, my principal interest as a business person, my principal interest as a board member of Millennium Village is making sure these ideas, which today are a little bit precious and very dependent on continuing donor support, connect and are turned to the degree that they can be into businesses. And frankly, I don't know the answer. I don't know if that can happen. I think it can. But it's taken us 9 months of work and virtually half-time of 2 of my Africa-based staff to put together a $750,000 loan guarantee that unlocks $1.5 million for one village. Now that is not scalable. I can't scale. So we sat down with them and we said, you got to get these loans and these businesses in these villages to the point where they're scalable. On the positive side, we've gone from having no intermediating structures to now having fully functioning co-ops in a couple of the villages. In other villages, we've got fully functioning companies, and those things can be the basis for growth. So what did we learn about this? One is that you probably want to better control your grantees' publicity. The second is that the villages are probably too small on an economic basis to really represent scale, and that they're going to have to reach out more broadly into the catchment area around them, which is a good thing, because that means without very much additional cost, you're going to take some of the benefit, not all, because you're not going to reach out with the health and you're not going to reach out with the education, but you're going to try to reach out with the economics to surrounding areas. And the other point you find very clearly is that one of the things that Africa is missing today is a developed entrepreneur class, and particularly a developed rural entrepreneur class. I mean, the hardest thing that we have to do in running the investment fund is to find deals to put money out into. And that is unusual, but it's the fact. Now, the question that then comes to mind is how do you improve that? And we've had some real success in doing that. In Sierra Leone, we found and in Zimbabwe, we found a very simple thing. We found by running business plan competitions, you find the weirdest people showing up with great ideas. You help them cultivate a business plan. And we've made about 20 investments, small investments, in ideas that would have never been found. So all of this is kind of a work in process. It's not elegant. It's what I would describe as messy work. But, you know, it's moving forward. Thank you.